Stories doomed to repeat themselves in the future. Oh, and repeat themselves they did. Anyway, hi, I'm Dream. Last time we saw the rise and fall of the so-called Ancients of Paldea. They were a really advanced civilization, but their greed and thirst for power brought them to their ruin. Unfortunately, they would not be the last to fall for the temptations of the great crater of Paldea, not by any means. An empire from 2,000 years ago suffered a similar fate. But why? Who were they? How was their empire formed? And what was the reason behind their downfall? The Paldean Empire is mysterious in more ways than one. So please, join me in this journey across history to learn more about them. I want to give a bit of a warning ahead of time. This part of the series will be a little more speculative. A lot of the specifics about the Paldean Empire are very unclear. The timeline of certain things is a little wonky, but I hope things will make a little more sense after this video. With that, let's pick things up where we last left them. After the fall of the Ancients, not many humans were left on the Paldean Peninsula. Instead of one big civilization, there were now instead multiple tribes spread across the entirety of the land. We know this because of information revealed in the anime. Ryford mentions how Paldea used to be divided into different countries, which is why the Paldean Empire built watchtowers to defend themselves. Most likely, this division existed even before the time of the Empire. The houses of Alfornada have a completely different style from the rest of Paldea's houses, for example, which indicates a difference in culture even if the town is more recent. We can look at Pokédex entries and NPC dialogue to figure out a little more about the culture of these different tribes, and even see how they interacted with each other. Looking at all this information is a lot of work, so thank you Kiss Game for the insane analysis on Pokemon distribution. God knows I would have gone insane if I had looked at that all by myself. The first notable things we can learn from these tribes is their very early interactions with Pokemon. We know about the 10,000-year-old Cyclizar murals, but there's many more Pokédex entries hinting at people from an older Paldea interacting with Pokemon in various ways. People in ancient times used Axeus tusks as cooking knives. Bounsweet were highly valued in the past because of the scarcity of sweeteners. Fidough and Daxbun have been protected since long ago because of how useful they are for cooking and farming. Skiddo and Gogoat are the most notable Pokemon by far, as they can be found everywhere and help people traverse the land or with their work. Cyclizar were used to travel too, but they're much more scarce. These early interactions with Pokemon are even documented in the Academy, in the Tome of People and Pokemon. Far in the past, humankind and Pokemon lived in mutual fear of one another, but some humans who loved and appreciated Pokemon made an effort to bridge this divide, and gradually, the two sides grew closer and found harmony. With this, we can start placing these tribes and figure out a little bit more about their culture. Fidough, Daxbun, and Bounsweet are found in very similar areas, mostly concentrated in the South Province, which makes a lot of sense considering this is where we find a lot more residential areas and Cortondo, which seems to be the agricultural center of Paldea. In fact, location data for Axeus specifically states that it lives at the foot of Glaciado Mountain, but it's still found in the South Province. Why? Well, because it was brought there to make cooking knives. In other words, the South Province was most likely home to tribes that focused on agriculture, crafts, baking, and things of the sort. Maybe even the areas where Artazon and Medali now are. Moving over to the west, we find Porto Marinada and Cascarrafa. We don't know much about the Cascarrafa from back then, as NPC dialogue states that Gofu made a lot of changes to it to make it more appealing to tourists. But we do know that Cyclizar used to help people climb their way up to the different levels of the city before elevators were installed. We can guess this is why some Cyclizar are in this area. Even long in the past, people needed help to climb the uneven mountains of Paldea. As for Porto Marinada, this town was probably created as a result of sea travel. Sea travel is old as hell, and we have a lot of evidence of it happening in Paldea. The appearance of Stormjourner, for example, who is explicitly made from rocks from faraway lands, most likely from the time of Calyrex's empire. Quaxley and other foreign Pokemon point at this too. The same thing can be said about Lavinthia, as this used to be a port town that exported ores from the mines in Zapapico. Lastly, we don't know much about Montenevera, but it was most likely also populated by some people. After all, Gogoat and Skiddo live even in the snowy mountains. Seriously, they're everywhere. As you can see, Paldea was home to a variety of cultures, both from local tribes and from foreign regions that wanted to trade with Paldea because of its exports. This is the case even today, as Mesagotha, the capital, is known for being a trade hub in the past. However, this peaceful time of trades and exchanges wouldn't last forever. At some point, legends surrounding the Great Crater and old fairy tales of the ancients must have reached the ears of kings and emperors from faraway places. As Ryford explains in her second history class, about 2,000 2,000 years ago, this region came under the rule of the Paldean Empire. This is extremely vague and I hate it, and why are you teaching history? Empires don't just appear out of nowhere. You could have at least specified how it was formed. Anyway, we can make a few guesses. The same history class mentions that the Emperor was looking for ways to gain power to stand against Paldea's neighboring countries, which is what causes them to explore the Great Crater. There are two ways in which we can take this information, and I want to present them both because I think they're equally as likely. The first possibility is that the Paldean Empire was created from within. It is difficult to defend yourself against countries that are organized when your people are scattered between different tribes and you don't hold much military strength in comparison. Only 1,000 years ago, Kalos had won a war against an unknown country with the power of something akin to a nuclear bomb. Galar has Calyrex, who can see the fucking future. Paldea has, I don't know, cool dragon bikes? Maybe they hadn't threatened Paldea directly, but the increasing amount of trade and their proximity could have been seen as a threat to a large group of people. The need to defend their own culture might have kickstarted the birth of the empire, in an attempt to find something they could have defended themselves with. Someone who amassed a lot of military strength and enough support from the people could have eventually become the emperor that ruled the region with an iron fist. Not without resistance, seeing as we don't exactly remember the emperor in a favorable light, but it could have happened. The second possibility is that the Paldean Empire was formed by someone who conquered the land of Paldea. Have you heard of a little something called the Roman Empire? Okay, wait, stay in your seat, I promise this is leading somewhere. Pokemon is known for taking inspiration from history and real life when building their regions, and they explicitly do this to make the players feel like they're a part of the game. This is explained in the official Galar Expedition Guide, which I really recommend reading if you're interested in learning about Game Freak's design philosophy when it comes to regions. Small tangent aside, the Roman Empire succeeded in conquering and occupying the Iberian Peninsula in 19 BC. How many years ago is that? Just a little over 2,000. They invaded the peninsula and took the territories that used to belong to the natives and Carthage? Obviously, they wanted power against the Carthaginian Empire and more control over the Western Mediterranean, but they were also interested in the mines of what would become Hispania Romana. Conquest over the Iberian Peninsula has been a huge part of Spanish history. Gothic Hispania, Al-Andalus, the Reconquest, etc. So, going back to the topic of the Paldean Empire, I think it is likely that the region coming under the rule of the Paldean Empire is a mimicry of Spanish history. Not only is the time at which the Paldean Empire appeared a reference to the Roman Empire, but other things too. The use of the word emperor, or the fact that the expeditions into Area Zero were driven by a desire to stand against neighboring countries. The expression came under the rule implies a sort of submission to someone who is above, and I feel like the Japanese for this history lesson echoes the same sentiment as well. Yaku 2000年前、この地方はパルデア帝国によって治め始められた。The use of the passive voice here is what's important. The act of being ruled is something that is done to the region. By itself, it doesn't mean anything special, but when you pair it with the other details, I think this theory gains a lot of weight. Regardless of how the empire was formed, it clearly stood at the center of the region 2,000 years ago. Mezagotha was probably its capital. The building that now belongs to the academy resembles a castle, with walls to protect it in a punishing climb. The edges of Paldea, especially the west ones, probably didn't belong to the empire as they exist within the areas outside the watchtowers built by them. This is an approximation of how the region was probably divided back then. The Emperor of Paldea seemed to be obsessed with the legends surrounding the Great Crater, as he started sending people into it to find a treasure that supposedly lied at the bottom. He used a lot of resources for this, both people and money, all to kickstart the supposed great era of exploration. A really interesting detail we can find in Medali is this amphitheater. Medali is the closest town to the Zero Gate, which could lead us to believe this was the place where adventurers were gathered before being sent into these expeditions. This amphitheater could have been used to hype people up, to spread the Emperor's propaganda and talk about riches and glory. And people, at the start, probably ate it up. They loved the Emperor, and people of all genders and ages joined the expansion of the Empire. Just look at Armarouge's Pokédex entry. Armarouge evolved through the use of a set of armor that belonged to a distinguished warrior. This Pokemon is incredibly loyal. Armarouge evolves through the use of the Auspicious armor, which contains auspicious wishes, success, loyalty. Armarouge probably references the golden era of the Empire, where everything seemed to be going well, and it may have lasted a long time, but there was a turning point. The resounding failure of this great era of exploration almost certainly heightened the air of mystery surrounding the crater. This era lasted for approximately 1,000 years, but not a single soul was able to venture all the way to the deepest reaches of Area Zero. The expeditions didn't produce results, but they cost the Empire a lot of manpower and money to support. At some point, they had to start playing on the defense, building forts to protect themselves against attacks from the other countries, watchtowers to watch over outsiders, maybe even their own people. The fiery blades on its arms burned fiercely with the lingering resentment of a sword wielder who fell before accomplishing their goal. Cerulage's Pokédex entry implies a change in mentality in the warriors of that time. No longer that they longed for success, and they weren't loyal either. They were resentful towards the Empire that made them fight relentlessly, while they wasted resources in a mission that never produced any results. At some point, it's hard to imagine people voluntarily join the army. And why would they go on expeditions willingly? Doing that was just throwing your own life away. Imagine the state of the amphitheater. No longer treating expeditions as something to look forward to, but instead, something to fear. Punishment. It was either you join the fight or you go into Area Zero. Your choice. We can actually put a timestamp to this change in mentality. It started happening around 1,500 years ago. This is when Gimmighoul started to appear. Why did people have to pay taxes and money to their ruler to fund a war they didn't want? It wanders around carrying an old coin on its back. It survives by draining the life force from humans to try to pick up its coin. And the nobles that hid in forts or watchtowers away from the masses, they simply collected more and more, forcing people to slave away to fill their pockets. This Pokemon was born inside a treasure chest around 1,500 years ago. It sucks the life force out of the scoundrels who try to steal its treasure. Even the fairy tale people made about Gimmighoul symbolized the decadence of the Empire. The Emperor represented as a princess, mindlessly picking up coins from the floor without noticing the castle crumbling in the background. Why was she collecting coins in the first place? Not even she knows. Just as the Emperor blindly explored Area Zero, like a kid with his eyes set on the ground after hearing a pretty little legend. It was no wonder that at some point, the Paldean Empire fell. No soldiers to defend themselves with, no money to keep rebuilding the forts, and an unhappy population. The cries of long ago were now nothing more than a whimper, choked by the power of the Empire's neighboring enemies. Eventually, all of the region united into one entity, and the Paldea as we know it was formed. An academy replaced the Emperor's castle. Paldea resumed its activities from before the Empire. It went back to the trade hub it always had been, a place that welcomed and celebrated incoming cultures instead of keeping them out. Those seeking knowledge need look no further than the oranges or grapes of Paldea. That proverb began to be used, not only in Paldea but in other regions too. But we have one more fairy tale to talk about. At some point, a merchant from the east arrived in Paldea with 4 treasures and presented them to the king. We know it had to have happened after the formation of the academy for 2 main reasons. The first is the use of the word king or osama in Japanese, which is very different from emperor or kote, implying that the fairy tale is referring to a different way of ruling entirely. The other is what Dryford says. These particular tablets were wooden and used as a writing medium in the East in ancient times. As you may know, they fell out of popular use as paper became more universally available. For the king to consider these paper substitutes treasures, they must have been of superb quality. That, or perhaps they had some amazingly profound teachings written on them. Paper was not popularized in Europe until the era between the 10th and 12th century. Aha! So then, that necessarily means this fairy tale happened after the formation of the academy, once paper became universally available. It's very likely that Paldea still had a king, even if they were basically just a figurehead or a trace of the old monarchy, just like real Spain. The king showered the merchant with coins, leaping with joy at the rarities he had been presented with. But that night, the Pokemon haunting those treasures awakened and reduced the castle to rubble. To seal those incarnations of disaster, the king called upon Pokemon wielders who sealed them somewhere in Paldea. Pokemon wielders? Merchants from the east? Who could that be? Around the same time the academy was formed, perhaps a little earlier, a certain group of people left their land when their hero disappeared. A group of people known as the Celestica. I believe these merchants are none other than people from the Ginkgo Guild, some of whom we know act as Pokemon wielders. In fact, the term Pokemon wielders has only ever been used before in Legends Arceus, even in Japanese. This is a very, very important point as it creates a strong link between these people and Pokemon Europe. Now we know their influence spread even to Paldea. The story, however, was treated as nothing more than a fairy tale. People doubted the words of the king, and who could blame them? Paldea's relationship with nobility had soured, and tales of all-powerful treasures have brought the region nothing more than ruin in the past. Just look at how the expeditions into Area Zero went. Treasures were nothing more than fairy tales. What was important now was only one thing: knowledge. Paldea has no more room for fairy tales, no more room for fantastical tales, no more room for mysteries. With one final fairy tale, the culture of the ancients takes its last breath. And if someone writes another impossible story about impossible treasures in the future, well, they must be nothing more than another fraud. With that, I'll see you next time. Keep dreaming.